All right, good afternoon, everyone. All right, one big presentation. We're going to talk about POTS, Usoc, telephony, and the 25 pair concept of the color code. All right, so let me just go here. Oh, can I do that? 5. Doesn't want to work. All right, let's do it the other way. Slideshow. From beginning. There we go. Now we have, it's a slow fade. All right, so today's topic, we're going to cover telephony, USOC, POTS, and the 25 pair color concept. So let's jump to the first slide right away. All right. I'm pretty sure everybody knows who I'm talking about, but we're going to go through that thing anyways, because you know what? He deserves it. He was 29 when he invented the telephone. 29. His first spoken words on the telephone was, "Watson, come here. I want to see you." Who, though? Oh, you will see. I'm pretty sure you know. Okay. Well, considering where we are, close to the city of Brantford, Ontario, we all should know who that was. Here's the thing. He refused to keep telephone in his office. Why? And when you see what the telephone looked like in his office, didn't this guy spill battery acid on himself? I don't know that story. So he refused to keep the telephone in his office because, in his view, a telephone was a distraction in 1876. Okay. So what inspired him to invent this thing? His mother, Eliza, was hard of hearing, so speech pathology was of his interest since early years of his life. He wanted to help his mother. All right, if you want to see more, I'm pretty sure there's a lot of links. There's one of them here. Once you download the presentation, you could click on that. All right, of course, we're talking about Alexander Graham Bell. And that was not the first telephone that was used. The first telephone, we'll see what it looked like. All right, the first telephone looked like. Did I just say that was not the first telephone? Well, maybe officially, somebody's first telephone looked like this. There was a mouthpiece and there's a earpiece or a receiver. You would take this thing off, hook that receiver, and put it right to your ear, just like that, and you will be talking. So if you watch some of the good old black and white movies, and I say good old black and white movies because some of the black and white old movies I would still prefer over a lot of the high tech now. But that's besides the point. All right. There is something that's called a centennial transmitter, and we'll see how what it looked like now. It was such a big deal that the telephone was invented because just think about it. You couldn't communicate with each other over long distance. As far as voice, it would be as far as you could see each other and hear each other if you're shouting and screaming, right? But from one city to another, you would have to write a letter and send a pigeon, or you would have to use post office delivery service, and they would use horses and carriages. Um, it was such a big deal that in the beginning they actually used to make movies about using telephone. Right? So there we go. Now, more or less, that was one of the first telephones. Yeah, here's Bell's first telephone. And here is a very cool gentleman that is using the telephone because he can, because it's important for him to have a telephone in his office. So he's going to use it. Right? March 10, 1876, Alexander Graham Bell successfully telephones Thomas Watson for the first time, and there were come on. There were shows and events demonstrating how to use a telephone. Right? Early telephone exchange. Well, the invention was invented for some reason, is for people to um, communicate with. I'm just looking at the chat here. Wasn't the telegraph used before the telephone? Yes, telegraph was used before, but telegraph was a telegraph. And telephone was a telephone. Telegraph was using Morse code, more like Morse code. And it was quite a popular means of communication. Even well, during the Second World War, that was one of the most popular ways of communicating with the Morse code, using telegraph over the wires or over the air, which would be the radio transmission. You can still, if you're interested in amateur radio, there are amateur radio enthusiast clubs all over the place, and you could participate or partake of the whole fun that is going on, communicating with the whole world with your amateur radio, and you can use it on voice, and you can use also Morse code. So if you have a shortwave radio, or talk to me next class, I'll give you some links that you can actually listen to the communications on the over the shortwave, or basically the amateur radio band. There are websites that you can dial in, and you can control the radio. Well, you can't talk because you have to have a license for it, but you can listen. All right, so the idea was guerrilla radio. That's basically running radio station from without a license. Yeah, well, okay, maybe some people do. But these days it's not very difficult for people to triangulate onto your location. All right, so back to the topic. The idea, of course, was to communicate, for people to be able to communicate with each other using the telephone. So some sort of organized way had to be established, and this was one of the first telephone exchanges. There would be lovely ladies sitting at their stations, and this would be something like a small town, maybe telephone exchange, because this thing looks not too big. There are just few clients that are connected to those lines there. And basically, there was no dial tone at that time during the first years of telephone usage. There were different ways of enunciating some experimental things. But when somebody picked up the phone, there would be a light and maybe a buzzer, depending on the phone exchange, and the operator would see, and you would not hear a dial tone. You would hear a live person saying, "Number, please." That's what you would hear, "Number, please." So then she would patch you through the person that you want to talk. Yeah. Now, with some of the bigger cities, the telephone exchanges looked a little bit bigger, of course, and more complex. There was a whole culture of working class based on the telephone exchange, right? So things were lively. And from that to this, because this is what a telephone exchange looks like right now. It's just self-running. As long as there's power, it is running all by itself. Well, more efficient, but comparing to this, it loses its soul a little bit, right? Yeah, okay, let's not get too sentimental. All right, let's see the tech stuff here. Techie stuff. Well, telegraphy And based on that, telephony was established. What is the idea? You pretty much, I'm sure you have studied electrical machines if you're not studying right now. So this is something that has to do with electromagnetism. And this would be a coil, and there would be another coil connected through one wire, and the circuit was closed through the earth's ground. And there would be a battery, DC battery, just powering the whole thing up. So if somebody would be talking to this piece right here, the sound vibrations of somebody's voice would be transferred onto the core of the coil. The coil would produce electrical signals because of the changes of the magnetic flux, and that would be received on the other end, and it would be transduced into the membrane vibrations and air vibrations and the vibrations of your eardrum in your ear, and you would basically be able to communicate. So that's what it was. Now, there's also another reason why I wanted to show you this slide, because whenever you are going to program telephone systems, you're going to have in the section of line programming. So you can have telephone telephone lines programming section in the setup of telephone systems and extensions and features and whatnot. But in the telephone lines programming still, and I don't know why, some of the phone systems include the option of ground start or a loop start. This would be an example of a ground start. There's only one wire, and the circuit is complete through ground. Very inefficient way, not being used anymore. Actually, I have a friend from England that was, well, some years ago, England was getting transferred or converted from the ground start into the loop start. And the loop start uses two wires to complete the return path for the whole telephone line. So it uses a pair of wires instead of one single one. Right? So that was years ago. There was a time to convert the telephone systems from one system to another. And he told me some interesting stories because you would have to really be careful how you knock to people's houses and announce what they're here to do. He says that sometimes people will get kicked out and things are being thrown at them because, hi, I'm here to convert you. They meant the phone line, but some people thought maybe something else. But so the ground start would be it. It's not being used anymore. So if you're sending out the phone system in the line programming, always, if you're using the pods, and we'll talk about what pods is, use always loop start in order to properly configure the telephone lines configuration of the phone system. All right. Now that was a telegraph. Okay. And telegraph, what was the movie, the old Western movie, one of the classics? Once Upon a Time in the West, I think it was. And those telegraphs would be installed usually around the train stations, because train stations would have pretty well established path to install the wiring infrastructure from one city to another. And the Wild West, do they have telegraph in there? Maybe, but in the Once Upon a Time in the West, I think one of the first scenes is that some shady characters, of course, Wild West movies, they come to the train station and they mess up the telegraph station there. Yeah, so yeah. And for that, a Morse code was established, and that was used for quite a long time. I think the last official transmission using Morse code was concluded sometime in 1991, so not that long ago, right? But now Morse code is not being used except for some shortwave radio enthusiasts. Okay, even with the SOS, Save Our Souls, SOS, where's S? DDD, right? Whereas O, da da da, DDD, right? So that would be the SOS signal, calling for help. Titanic was sending that one, and well, all right. That would be what the telegraph lines would look like, running through the cities, and for the most part, they would run through along the railroads or roads, and you can still see some of the sentimental remains of some of the telegraph lines. If you drive out the countryside, you can see some of those abandoned lines, right? Makes you wonder who was talking through that, what was happening at that time, and whatnot. But I guess I have a tendency to go sentimental today, so I'm going to have to watch myself. Okay. Now, let's talk about something that's called tip and ring. But did I say, oh, yeah, here. All right. If you want to really get sentimental, here is the Telegraph Road. It's a song by Dire Straits, and I included a YouTube link for that. If you really want to, I'm not sure if he's gonna make you cry like in some romantic movies or something that I always cry, but it might it might trigger some sentimental devices in your brain. Okay. Hey everybody. Okay. Tip and ring. What's happening here? Okay, musicians here still use the tip and ring jacks or plugs, jacks and plugs, especially for the guitars and some keyboards and so on. And so it's very, fairly widely used device in the audio industry. What does tip and where does it come from? Remember that telephone exchange that the operators would have those patch cables? They used to use those, okay? And that's where it comes from. And it's a 1/4 inch type of jack. See, 1/4 inch, tip, ring, and sleeve. This one is. Because the diameter of this plug is 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch. Yeah. Now, the ones that you have for your headphones that look like this, except smaller, diameter is 1/8 inch. So the headphone jack, the small one, the miniature one, is called 1/8 inch, 1/8 inch jack. This is a 1/4 inch. What does this one have? It has tip, and that would be the tip. This would be the ring, just like the finger ring on the finger. And this would be the sleeve. Now, sometimes you're going to see ones with just the tip and the ring, and the sleeve is just eliminated so that the whole thing is extended. So you have just tip and ring sometimes, and sometimes you have tip, ring, and sleeve. What do we have here? Sleeve would be the signal ground. And if you were just to tip and ring, then the ring would be the signal ground, okay? And then we have the tip and ring. It would be the positive and the negative part of the signal. So ground is in the middle, positive part of the signal, and negative part of the signal. All right. Keep going. Now, when it comes to telephone line, and I'm talking about POTS, and POTS stands for plain old telephone service. Okay. Here is ring, here is tip. And when you have, and I just put red and green here, because when you're wiring the jacks, the tip would be green and the ring would be red. Okay. Now, notice one thing. Tip here is positive. Let's say this is just a tip and ring, so the sleeve is eliminated. This will be positive, this will be negative. So the tip is always positive with reference to the ring or sleeve. That's the reference. But here's one important thing that I want you to notice, and I want you to remember that. Even though the tip is more positive than the ring, and the tip sits at the level of the ground. So if you put a voltmeter between the tip and the ground, it should pretty much show you that there is no voltage there. It sits with a reference to ground. The tip is neutral. Yeah? Excuse me. There is a reason for that. You see those telegraph lines that we had here? Originally, they would carry the positive side of the signal and the ground would be ground. So this would be positive, this would be negative with reference to the positive, right? Just like you would normally imagine things would be. However, the problem was that the copper wires that were extended there were corroding a lot. Copper just gets weirdly corroded, kind of goes green kind of thing, right? So, and they would have to be replaced too often. So, you know, some experiments were conducted. And I always use the term they, yeah, they, okay, found out that if they reverse the polarity, the corrosion is not taking place. Things are not being corroded. So that's why this would be a negative with reference to ground. So this is more grounded than the ground itself, or more negative than the ground. Ground will be just, you know, it's a potential. You can be positive with reference to ground. You can be negative with reference to ground. Right? So that's why we have this. Tip is with a reference to ground, even though it's positive with reference to the ring. And it is idling at 48 volts DC. So if you have the POTS telephone outlet, you would be having negative 48 volts on the ring, idling at all times. Now, when it rings, the voltage jumps into 90 volts minimum, but it's a little bit different. Do I have that slide here or not? No, I don't. I'm going to have to include that later on. What happens is that when the telephone rings, you have that 48 volts or the negative 48 volts present on the ring, or yeah, so plus 48 volts with reference to ring, but this tip is neutral with reference to ground. You just have to kind of look at it long enough and grasp the idea of this whole thing. But when the telephone rings, there will be 90 volts AC superimposed, peak to peak, superimposed onto that tip. So then the volt, then, you know, so negative 48 volts with the 90 volts peak to peak riding on that 40 negative on the tip. And I'll have to show that to you later on when we talk in person. Also, I decided to include this button right here. So when you download this, and I'll also explain to you later on the idea, and maybe in some class, some lessons already explained it to you. How do balanced cable works? What's the difference of balanced signal and unbalanced signal? This would be a the type of a jack that would have to be used for a balanced signal. Because of the balanced signal, you have ground reference, and you have a positive signal, and you have a mirror image of that going the other way with reference to ground. And there is a reason for that. And we'll talk about that later. I click on that, it's going to give you just a tiny bit more information on it once you download this presentation. Usoc stands for Universal Service Ordering Code. Okay. Usoc configuration is part of the POTS configuration, and POTS stands for Plain Old Telephone Service. Usoc has to do with the pinout and the wiring that is accomplished onto the jack within the jack. This here jack is labeled as RJ11. It's just a regular telephone jack size, just magnified here, right? RJ stands for registered jack. Why is it called registered jack? Well, when in the early days of telephony, there were limited number of companies who could actually install and maintain the telephone service. But as the time progressed, as things progressed with time, there'll be more and more companies here, there, and everywhere, E-I-E-I-O, right? And they all had their own type of devices that they were making, their own ways of connecting things, and they will have their own jacks. So one company would not be compatible with another when it comes to interfacing one device to another, which led, sooner or later, it had to happen, to some standardization. So that's why the Universal Service Ordering Code is part of the standards that are being used. And RJ stands for registered jack. So if everybody would comply with this shape and this pinout of this jack, then the world would be just more beautiful. And we need more beautiful world. Just, think of your country, think of your children, right? Things need to be beautiful. And 11 is just a designation. Has nothing to do with 11 of something. Right? It's just, let's make it number 11. There's also RJ12, which is the same as RJ11, except if you see here, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 slots, and only 4 are being used with the prongs in them. So this one here is capable of handling 2 pairs because there's 4 conductors. RJ11 would have the outer ones also filled, so we would be capable of 3 pairs. RJ11, just 2 pairs. RJ12, same size, same footprint, but it just uses 3 pairs. So those would be filled with prongs and there would be connections there. And same here, okay, on the plug as well. RJ stands for registered jack. Usoc wiring configuration. All right, here's the jack. If you're looking at it from, if you're looking at the wall and there's a jack, you look into it, this is what you're going to see as far as configuration. Let's look at the other side. This is the old color code, quad cable. Pair number 1 is the 2 middle prongs. So this right here, this would be pair number 1. And this here would be pair number 2. That's how Usoc works. And this here, if there was RJ12, it was RJ12, then this would be pair number 3. Okay, so let's just take a look at this thing here. Excuse me. With the Usoc configuration, the wiring configuration, we just established the two middle prongs while we're counting pins from left to right. Here's a pin 1, pin 2, pin 3, and so on. But the pairs we're counting from the middle outwards. So here's pair 1. And look, tip and ring. It just, the terminology just stayed from the original times when telephones were being used and the telephone exchange, da. So the terminology has stayed. So here's tip and ring of pair 1, green and red. And here is tip and ring for pair number 2. And of course, here's tip and ring for pair number 3. And this would be the old color code. People didn't use too many lines at that time, so well, the colors were a little bit different. You can still see those, and you can still, when you just go to one of the local hardware stores and buy just a regular telephone jack, you're going to see those if you take the cover off, you're going to see these colors. So there's pair 1, here's pair 2, here's pair 3. If you were using just one SL line, and SL stands for single line, POTS line, plain old telephone service line, which is the most basic telephone line that exists. If there was just one line that you're connecting, you would just use the red and green here. And that's it. And they will be connected to the two middle prongs. That's it. And usually that will be the case with telephone installations. Then if you need more pairs to be carried on that outlet, then you would connect the wires accordingly. Now, how does that translate into the new color code that we're using? And this would be, perhaps, you could run, instead of getting Cat 3 or category 3 cable, which we'll talk about the categories, telephone wire, you can run a telephone signal through Cat 5e, Cat 6, Cat whatever, right? Because the telephone is going to run on a better cable, but you can't use data over the old telephone cable. It's just not going to travel. It's just not going to happen. Right? So this is how the color code translates from the old system to the new system. Here is pair number 1. Remember the last lab that we did? Blue, orange, green, brown. These are the first 4 pairs of the 25 pair color code, which we'll talk about, well, next, right? If I could say that. But this one here, since it only has 3 pairs, this is blue, orange, and green. And this here stripe would be the tip. And this here solid, so-called solid, would be the ring. And so on. So all the stripes would be tips. And all the solids would be rings. Okay. So this is how, how the color code is configured with the Usoc configuration. Data is a little bit different. Remember when we did the data jacks in our lab? Blue, orange, remember the dance that I did? Blue, orange, green, and brown. That would be the T568 type of a configuration for data. Now this, we're talking about the Usoc telephony. That's how that is being done. All right, enough. Oh, look, if you buy just a surface mount jack, because it mounts on the surface around the baseboard, very popular jacks in its own time. There will be RJ14 telephone jack, surface mount. And look, this one is capable of 2 pairs, red and green, black and yellow. Tip ring, green, red, black, yellow. And that's how they will be connected to the jack. All right, here's another visual on how things are being done. It's the same thing that now this would be carried through some quad wire. If it's short enough wire, then you could probably use telephone through that. However, within if you're using like a longer wire, then some twist would be necessary for that. And twist eliminates crosstalk. And crosstalk is a signal bleeding from one pair to another. With analog systems, it could be annoying. With digital systems, if you have a crosstalk, then the transmission just completely fails. We'll talk about that also later on. I'm just giving you a heads up. Here, yeah, okay, quad wire is not acceptable. However, the quad wire, which is basically not twisted, they're straight wires, it's used for connecting alarm sensors to the alarm system main board. Because we need no twist in that case. But when it comes to data transmission, we need twist. So it is difficult to get those colors, these wires right now in a Cat3 configuration, a telephone configuration. However, most of the time right now, you wouldn't run telephone wires for telephone outlets. You wouldn't run category 3 cables, which was considered a telephone cable. You just run Cat5e minimum everywhere. And you can use that for telephone transmissions as well as data. So you have the option, right? Let's talk about some terminology here. Demarcation point, or so-called the demarc. And we have a couple of boxes like that in the lab. You know where the cage is, and there's a plywood board mounted to that cage, and there's a bunch of devices screwed onto the plywood, so you can take a look at that, touch and play with it. This would be the simple demarcation point for the Usoc or for the pots. Right? This one is capable of 2 lines. Look, here's green and red, so it's going to be tip and ring. And here is just the RJ11 jack with the piece of wire that is connected to those 2 screw terminals here. So here's line, and here's another separate line. And those underneath are connected to these screw terminals, and that's where the telephone line comes from the city. And this one is capable of line 1 and line 2. And this prong right here, this terminal right here, is a ground termination. And this whole thing right here on the left is serves as a lightning protection. This has this material, whatever is being used, and it's constructed in a way that has enough conductivity or resistivity that normally it just doesn't conduct under normal circumstances. But when the voltages go really high, or lightning, then some conductivity starts taking place. So the lightning is not supposed to go through to the other side, and you just have to escape to the ground. Right? And these would be those gray boxes that are maybe on the side of your house, or maybe inside the basement or something like that. This would be a typical demarcation point. And the demarcation point, what does the demarc stands for? The demarcation, basically it means a point of entry. So that's where all the telephone lines are coming into the building. So demarc point would be considered like a telecommunications room that is considered to be the main telecom room for whatever the building is. Now, what do we have here? We have a box, distribution box, that is capable of, well, this one is capable of 100 pairs. If you open that, you're going to see a bunch of buttons with the line numbers. And if you want to activate one, you just push that one in. the button. Of course, it has to be activated on the other side as well in the central office. So just pushing the button will not get you anywhere unless the line is configured to be live. And from there, there is a 100-pair cable coming out. Right? And it's being split to 25-pair connector, 25-pair connector, and so on. So 4 25-pair connectors, and they are terminated on the back of those connectors, and the pairs are being brought forward so they could be cross-connected using something that's called cross-connect wire. And that pair can be cross-connected to whatever pair on the other side, and this would be the field wiring. So this would be the telephone wires going to the individual telephones on the desktops and stuff. Pretty clever system. There's also a T1 configuration here because a telephone, regular telephone, would require a physical 1 pair to be established. There are T1 lines, and the T1 configuration, we'll talk about that. Maybe that's the next slide here. No. The T1 it's a multiplexed signal, just like the air. In the air, we have a multiplexed vibrations from various different radio stations, and they're just all mixing in the air. So the air is multiplexing them, which means it's combining them. All the waves are vibrating. Then we have something that is called a demultiplexer. Technically, it could be called demultiplexer because it just picks up, it tunes to a specific frequency that many frequencies are present in the air, but the tuner of your radio in your car is tuning to the specific frequency. So it's like demultiplexing things as far as frequency division multiplexing is concerned. We will talk about that later too. I just want you to be familiar with some of the terms I'm just pronouncing here, okay? So those T1 connections are they have a multiplexed signal, so there could be 2 pairs only, and they in those 2 pairs, because one would be configured as a transmitting pair or signal going one way, and the other pair would be having signal going the other way. So one is transmit, one is receive. And just like using the tuning and a little bit more complicated, sort of, in the radio frequencies, those frequencies will be multiplexed onto the 2 pairs, and you could have maybe 5 lines, 6 lines, 7 lines. I forgot what T1 is capable of, right? There's T1 that's used in North America, and there's E1 that's used in India and Europe. And I think they're capable of like 22 lines or something like that. On two pairs, you can have frequency encoded, if you can say that, more than 1 telephone line, more than 2. It's about 20 something lines. So sometimes you're going to see this. Now, when it comes to the VoIP telephone systems, this here is becoming a little bit obsolete now, but you can still see a lot of it. So you better learn how to use that, because service calls mean you're earning money. Do I have to explain? I don't think so. So these POTS signals are becoming, in a lot of cases, you're not going to see any new installations using that, unless there's some specific request. But there are a lot of existing systems like that. Then those T1 connections in North America, that's what it is. These are like modems, okay? And from there, the lines are being split and fed into the telephone systems. though these are also becoming less and less popular because of the VoIP telephone systems are kicking in big time. They're making a big move onto the market. And with the VoIP, which is voice over IP, voice over internet protocol, they're using internet or part of the internet bandwidth in order to carry so many telephone lines and so on. So they are called SIP lines, and SIP stands for Session Initiation Protocol. And if any machine establishes a communication with another machine, which is a computer, you Google, you want to see how many kinds of giraffes exist in Africa. Then you would click on Google, for example, as a search engine. Your computer establishes a session with the Google server. And you have a session established and you keep going with the exchange of information. So the SIP lines are called Session Initiation Protocol lines, and they are not physical, but they're virtual because they're using internet to create telephone lines or voice channels. Let's keep going. Parts filtering. Parts filtering. Do we have time? Yes, we got a couple of minutes still. Plain old telephone service, related terminology, DSL, dry loop, and voice. And also, besides the dry loop, it's also being used in communications, but I didn't write it down here and I purposely didn't do that. There's also something that's called hard loop, because the hard loop is not supposed to be confused with the dry loop. Let's take a look at what's, okay, well, all right. Before we used to have just the voice lines, which would be the telephone lines, the basic POTS lines. Later on, the technology developed to the point that you could superimpose the data signal, which would be the internet signal. And remember, the internet signal coming from the city to your house, from that wall in your house, from the modem, the signal is delivered in an analog form, just like the radio frequencies over the radio. The modem demodulates that, because modem stands for modulate and demodulate, modulate, demodulate, modem. So there's two words combined and another word was born, which was called modem. Then the modem modulates and demodulates signal on the side of your house of the modem. The signal is in a digital form. On the other side of the modem, it's in an analog form. So that signal, the internet signal, was superimposed onto the voice lines, which would be the telephone line. So you could use a telephone, and at the same time, you could use a computer because the signal is superimposed onto the line. Before that happened, you would have the dial-up internet, dial-up internet. You would dial a telephone number to connect to a server, and you couldn't use the telephone. So then the multiplexing has been established. So digital subscribers line was established. DSL line, DSL form of internet goes over the phone lines, over the phone line. Right. However, this created a problem because whenever you wanted to talk on the phone, you pick up the phone and you would hear that annoying internet signal buzz on the phone line. So the filtering has to be established to eliminate that buzz. So if you want to use the voice, you would just use the voice part of those wires. And through the same wires, if you want to use internet, that internet will be connected to the modem of the thing. So there'll be no conflicts and whatnot. Later on, what happened is the cell phones became more and more popular. You're talking late 90s towards the beginning of 2000s. Right? Cell phones were really, now everybody has a cell phone. Right? It's 2023 at this point of recording this presentation. So some people decided to, well, since everybody has a cell phone, why do we need to pay for the landline, for the regular POTS line? Let's just eliminate it. But we still want, so they call the telephone providing company, is it possible to keep the internet signal on the phone line, but we don't want to pay for the phone? We just don't want to use the phone number, so we don't want to use that service. And the wonderful people at the other end said, yes, it can be done. We're just going to remove the voice and the dial tone from that line, but we're going to keep the DSL signal on that pair, so it still can be delivered to your house, and that's called a dry loop. A dry loop is a telephone line containing a DSL signal without the capability of the phone or voice. Now, in order to eliminate that annoying buzz, if you still wanted to use the phone through the same line, you would have to plug in the POTS filter into the telephone jack, and your telephone would go into this filter. So this would filter out the DSL buzz. You could do that, and you would have to plug into every single jack where the phone is plugged in. Or at the demarc point where the telephone line is coming into your building, you would connect that into the line terminals. And this would be a splitter, or split filtering, POTS filter. Out of these two terminals, there would be no voice signal, just the modem signal would go to the modem. So we would connect these two terminal line right to the modem. And these you would connect to the phone line that goes to the rest of the building, so you don't have to use these at every jack. And this welcome DSL POTS filter, you could use screw terminals for the telephone lines, or if you want, you can use the jacks. Doesn't matter which one. You could connect this thing with the screw terminals, and you can get them out of, it's just the way it's configured that it's possible to do. So you can either use the jacks, or you can use the bare screw terminals. And depending on the installation and situation, you will run into a different different need, or it was a very so this is example of one of the POTS filters. There are other ones too. Okay, so we're going to stop right here, and we're going to continue next time. We're going to see each other, whenever that is. Yep, I'll see you when I see you, and thank you for your attention. We got 37, 35, and I can see the counter is going down right now. Thank you guys, you're wonderful, and see you next time.